I thought showing up to my cousin's engagement dinner would bring my family closer together. Instead, one quiet sentence from my mom shattered me in front of everyone at the table. I spent the entire night trying not to cry while relatives watched in silence, until I finally said something that changed everything forever. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. Let me ask you to subscribe, like, and share. In the comments section, tell us which city you live in. I arrived at my cousin's engagement dinner already carrying that familiar feeling of being the odd one out in my own family. The restaurant was one of those upscale places with dim golden lighting, expensive wine bottles lining the walls, and soft jazz playing quietly in the background. Everyone inside looked polished and effortless, like they had stepped straight out of a holiday family commercial. My relatives were already gathered around the long private table near the back of the room, laughing loudly over cocktails while taking photos together. My aunt was fixing my cousin's hair every few seconds for pictures, my uncles were arguing over sports like always, and everyone seemed completely relaxed and happy. Meanwhile, I was standing near the entrance trying to catch my breath after driving almost 3 hours directly from work. I had barely made it in time. I skipped eating, changed clothes in a gas station bathroom halfway through the drive, and honestly felt exhausted before I even walked through the doors. But despite all of that, I still came because my cousin and I had always been close growing up, and I genuinely wanted to support her on one of the biggest nights of her life. The second my heels touched the restaurant floor, I regretted coming. My mom noticed me immediately from across the room. She stopped mid-conversation, slowly looked me up and down, and her entire expression changed into that familiar look I knew too well, disappointment mixed with judgment. She walked over toward me with a tight smile on her face, leaned closer like she was about to say something kind, and quietly whispered, "You really came dressed like that?" Her tone wasn't loud enough for anyone else to hear, but it hit me harder than if she had shouted it across the restaurant. I instantly looked down at myself, suddenly hyper-aware of every detail. I was wearing a simple black dress with a light cardigan and flats because I came straight from work and didn't exactly have time for a full makeover. It wasn't glamorous, but it wasn't inappropriate either. Till the way she said it made me feel cheap, careless, and embarrassing within seconds. I tried to force a laugh and pretend the comment didn't bother me. That had basically become my survival tactic around her over the years. If I acted unbothered, maybe the moment would pass faster. "Traffic was terrible, Mom," I said quietly while adjusting my sleeves nervously. I barely made it here on time. But instead of understanding, she just sighed dramatically and shook her head. "Everyone else managed to put in effort," she replied before walking away toward the table again. Just like that. No hello. No hug. No, I'm glad you made it safely. Only criticism within the first 30 seconds of seeing me. I stood there near the entrance for a moment pretending to check my phone because I suddenly felt too embarrassed to walk over to the table. Sounds ridiculous now, but her words immediately pulled me backward into every other moment growing up when she made me feel like I was never quite enough. Too quiet. Too emotional. Too awkward. Too plain. No matter what I did, there always seemed to be something about me that needed fixing. And somehow, even at 27 years old, one sentence from her could still make me feel like a nervous teenager again. I could already feel my confidence slipping before dinner had even officially started. Then my cousin spotted me from across the room and immediately jumped up with the biggest smile on her face. "You made it!" she shouted excitedly before pulling me into a hug. For a second, the warmth in her voice helped ease the tightness in my chest. She looked genuinely happy I was there, and that alone almost made the stressful drive worth it. But even while hugging her, I could still feel my mom's eyes on me from across the table, silently judging every part of my appearance. And deep down, I had this awful feeling the night was only going to get worse from there. I tried my best to laugh off my mom's comment because making things awkward right away felt like the last thing I wanted to do. I kept telling myself not to let it ruin the evening before it had even properly started. So I smiled, straightened my cardigan, and followed everyone toward the long dinner table while pretending her words hadn't landed directly in the center of my chest. Private dining room was beautiful in an almost intimidating way. Small candles flickered along the middle of the table, reflecting softly against polished wine glasses and gold silverware. The engagement decorations were elegant without being overwhelming: pale flowers, handwritten place cards, tiny framed photos of my cousin and her fiancé during vacations and holidays together. Everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable in that environment, dressed in sleek dresses, pressed button-down shirts, and expensive shoes that probably cost more than my entire outfit. I suddenly became painfully aware of how simple I looked compared to everyone else in the room. I slid quietly into my seat near the far end of the table, hoping not to draw attention to myself. My cousin squeezed my shoulder before sitting back beside her fiancé, and for a few minutes things actually felt okay. Relatives were talking over one another, waiters moved around pouring drinks, and the atmosphere softened into the kind of warm family gathering I had originally imagined during the drive there. I even started relaxing enough to join a conversation with one of my aunts about work and apartment hunting. But every time I began feeling comfortable, my mom somehow found a way to pull me right back into that uncomfortable feeling again. It started with tiny comments that sounded harmless if you didn't know her the way I did. She glanced at my hair while sipping wine and casually said, "You used to take more pride in your appearance." A few minutes later, while everyone discussed engagement photos, she leaned toward my aunt and said just loudly enough for me to hear, "She never listens when I try to help her look more presentable." Then, during dinner orders, she looked at my face for a second and added, "You look tired. Are you sleeping at all? Maybe some makeup would help cover that." Each sentence came wrapped in this fake concern that made it impossible to openly react without sounding overly sensitive. That was always her strategy. Nothing direct enough for people to call cruel, but sharp enough to slowly chip away at me in front of everyone. I kept forcing small smiles while staring down at the menu, pretending to be interested in appetizers I couldn't even focus on reading. Inside, though, I could feel myself shrinking smaller and smaller. Strange how certain people can reduce your confidence within minutes simply because they know exactly where your insecurities live. Growing up, my mom constantly compared me to other girls, cousins, classmates, daughters of her friends. Someone always dressed better, spoke better, looked prettier, acted more feminine, or seemed more successful than me. Even when she wasn't openly criticizing me, there was always this underlying message that I could become acceptable if I just changed enough things about myself. I spent years trying to earn approval that never fully came, and sitting there at that engagement dinner suddenly made me realize how exhausted I was from still chasing it. Meanwhile, everyone else around the table continued enjoying the night, completely unaware of the emotional war happening quietly beside them. My uncles were debating travel plans for the wedding. My younger cousins were taking selfies together and laughing over old childhood stories. Glasses clinked together during toasts. The smell of steak, garlic butter, and expensive perfume filled the room. From the outside, it probably looked like a perfectly normal family celebration. But inside my head, every one of my mom's comments replayed louder than the conversations around me. I started becoming hyper-aware of everything about myself. Whether my hair looked messy under the lighting, whether my dress seemed too plain, whether everyone secretly agreed with her but were too polite to say it out loud. At one point, I caught my reflection in the dark restaurant window beside the table and barely recognized my own expression. I looked tense, quiet, almost apologetic for taking up space there. That realization hurt more than my mom's actual words. I had entered the restaurant excited to celebrate someone I loved, but less than an hour later, I was sitting there questioning my appearance, my worth, and whether I even belonged with my own family. And the worst part was knowing this wasn't new. This was simply the same pattern repeating itself again, me trying to enjoy an important moment, and my mom somehow finding a way to remind me that, in her eyes, I was still falling short. Things shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely painful the moment the conversation around the table turned toward family relationships. Until then, I had still been trying to convince myself I could survive the night quietly if I just stayed calm and kept smiling. I focused on my food, nodded politely during conversations, and avoided looking directly at my mom whenever possible. But after the main course arrived and people had relaxed into that loose, emotional mood that usually comes after a couple glasses of wine, one of my older aunts suddenly looked toward me and asked, "So where have you been hiding lately? We barely see you at family gatherings anymore." Her tone wasn't judgmental at all. If anything, she sounded genuinely curious. But the second the question left her mouth, I felt tension immediately tighten across my shoulders because I already knew my mom wouldn't let me answer for myself. Before I could even open my mouth, my mom gave this dramatic little laugh and leaned back in her chair like she was about to tell a funny story. "Oh, she's too busy acting independent these days," she said while swirling her wine glass casually. "Apparently family becomes less important once you decide you don't need anybody anymore." A few relatives laughed awkwardly, probably assuming she was joking, but I felt my stomach drop instantly. I stared down at my plate for a second, hoping maybe she would stop there, but she kept going. "You know how she is," she added with a shrug. "Always distant lately. Hard to get her to show up for anything." I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. The words themselves might not sound devastating to an outsider, but what hurt was how unfair they were. For the past 2 years, I had done more for my mom than almost anyone else in the family knew. When her car broke down, I paid for repairs even though I was struggling financially myself. When she needed rides to medical appointments because nobody else was available, I rearranged my work schedule to take her. There were nights I stayed on the phone with her for hours while she cried about stress, loneliness, or family drama. I had spent so much time trying to support her emotionally, financially, and physically whenever she needed me, often at the expense of my own mental health. Yet there she was, casually painting me as selfish and disconnected in front of the entire family like none of those things had ever happened. What made it worse was that nobody at the table knew the full story. They didn't know how many family events I skipped because I was working overtime trying to stay financially stable. They didn't know how emotionally drained I'd become after years of constantly being criticized every time I walked into a room with my mom. They only saw the version she presented, the distant daughter who slowly pulled away from family for no reason. And because my mom was naturally charismatic in social settings, people tended to believe her version of things without questioning it too deeply. I could feel heat rising into my face while everyone around the table suddenly became very interested in their drinks, napkins, or food. That awkward silence families create when they know something uncomfortable is happening but nobody wants to acknowledge it directly. One of my cousins quietly changed the subject by asking about wedding venues, but the damage had already been done. My appetite disappeared completely after that. I pushed food around my plate while trying to keep my expression neutral, even though internally I felt humiliated. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from being misunderstood by strangers, but it hurts differently when it comes from your own parent, especially when they know the truth and choose to ignore it anyway. As conversations continued around me, my mind kept replaying everything I had sacrificed over the years trying to maintain peace with my mom. I remembered answering late-night calls while exhausted from work because I knew she'd accuse me of not caring if I didn't pick up. I remembered sending money I couldn't really spare because she sounded stressed. I remembered sitting in waiting rooms during her appointments, listening patiently to her problems, constantly trying to be a good daughter, even when our relationship emotionally drained me. And suddenly, sitting there listening to her reduce me to some cold, selfish person in front of relatives felt almost surreal. It made me realize how invisible my efforts had always been to her. No matter how much I gave, she somehow only noticed the moments when I wasn't available enough. At one point, I looked around the table and wondered if anyone could see how hard I was trying not to cry. My chest felt tight, my hands were shaking slightly under the table, and I could feel that familiar pressure building behind my eyes. But years of dealing with my mom had taught me how to hide emotional pain in public. So I kept my posture straight, nodded occasionally during conversations, and pretended to listen while internally fighting the urge to walk out right then and there. Cruelest part was that my mom looked completely relaxed after saying those things. She smiled, laughed with relatives, and continued sipping wine like she hadn't just publicly rewritten our entire relationship in the most unfair way possible. And in that moment, surrounded by family members chatting under warm candlelight, I realized something that hurt more than her words themselves. My mom genuinely believed her own version of the story. In her mind, I wasn't the daughter who showed up repeatedly despite emotional exhaustion. I was simply the daughter who could never quite meet her expectations, no matter how much of myself I gave trying. About halfway through the dinner, the energy in the room shifted again, but this time in a softer, more emotional direction. My cousin's fiancé stood up from his chair holding a champagne glass, gently tapping it with a fork to get everyone's attention. Conversations slowly faded, and the room became quiet except for the faint music still playing somewhere beyond the private dining area. He smiled nervously at my cousin before beginning a heartfelt speech about how grateful he was to have both families there celebrating with them. Everyone immediately focused on him, and for a few moments the tension sitting inside my chest loosened slightly because the attention was no longer on me or my mom. His voice shook a little while talking about how much my cousin had changed his life, how excited he was for their future together, and how important family support meant to both of them. It was sweet and genuine in a way that made several people emotional almost instantly. As he spoke, I looked around the table and saw relatives smiling warmly at one another, some already tearing up while listening. My cousin reached for his hand halfway through the speech, visibly trying not to cry herself. Candles flickered softly across the table, glasses sparkled under the dim lighting, and for a brief moment the entire evening finally felt peaceful. It should have been one of those comforting family memories people look back on years later with affection. I wanted so badly to be emotionally present in that moment. I wanted to focus on my cousin's happiness and enjoy seeing someone I loved enter a beautiful new chapter in life. But despite how touching the speech was, I could still feel the emotional weight of the entire evening pressing down on me like a physical ache. Truth was, I had spent so much energy trying not to react to my mom all night that my body felt completely exhausted. My shoulders were painfully tense, my jaw hurt from forcing polite smiles, and my stomach had been tied in knots since the second I arrived. Even while everyone clapped after the speech ended, I realized I couldn't fully breathe anymore. That overwhelming pressure behind my eyes had returned stronger, and I knew if I stayed sitting there much longer, I was either going to cry in front of everyone or completely lose control of my emotions. So the moment attention shifted back into casual conversations, I quietly excused myself from the table and walked toward the restroom area near the back hallway of the restaurant. The second the restroom door closed behind me, my entire expression collapsed. I gripped the edge of the sink and stared at myself in the mirror under the harsh bathroom lighting, trying desperately to regain composure. My eyes already looked glossy, and there was this deep exhaustion written across my face that makeup couldn't hide even if I had worn more of it like my mom wanted. I turned on the faucet just to create noise because I didn't want anyone outside hearing me trying to study my breathing. Felt ridiculous in a way, being a grown woman hiding in a restaurant bathroom trying not to cry because of comments from her own mother. But emotional wounds built over years don't disappear simply because you become an adult. If anything, they sometimes cut deeper because you begin recognizing patterns you spent years trying to excuse. As I stood there staring into the mirror, memories started flooding back all at once. Every birthday where my mom criticized my appearance before guests arrived. Every family gathering where she made jokes at my expense while everyone laughed awkwardly. Every achievement that somehow became overshadowed by what I could have done better. I realized this dinner wasn't actually about my dress, my hair, or my attendance at family events. It was the accumulation of years spent feeling emotionally picked apart by someone whose approval I kept chasing anyway. That realization hit me harder than anything she'd said all night. I splashed cold water against my face and kept repeating quietly to myself, "Just get through dinner. Just survive another hour." But even those words sounded exhausting. I was tired of surviving family events instead of enjoying them. Tired of mentally preparing for criticism every time I saw my mom. Tired of shrinking myself to avoid conflict while still somehow becoming the problem anyway. And standing there alone in that bathroom, surrounded by marble counters and expensive perfume lingering in the air, I suddenly felt incredibly lonely despite being surrounded by relatives only a few feet away. A few moments later, the restroom door opened softly behind me. I quickly looked down, pretending to fix my hair, hoping whoever entered wouldn't notice how emotional I looked. But then I heard my younger cousin's voice gently say my name. When I turned around, she looked genuinely concerned. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked carefully. Her tone immediately told me she already knew the answer. I tried to force another small smile and brushed it off by saying I was just tired from work and the drive, but she didn't seem convinced. After a short pause, she quietly admitted, "I noticed the comments your mom's been making tonight. Honestly, other people noticed too." Hearing that nearly broke me more than the comments themselves. For the entire evening, part of me kept wondering if I was simply being overly sensitive again like my mom always claimed. But hearing someone else acknowledge what was happening made everything suddenly feel painfully real. My cousin stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You don't deserve that," she said softly. "Especially not here tonight." And for the first time all evening, I felt seen by someone in the room. Not judged. Not criticized. Not reduced into some disappointing version of myself. Just seen. That tiny moment of kindness almost undid me completely. I had spent hours silently carrying humiliation, anger, sadness, and self-doubt, convincing myself I needed to stay composed no matter what. But one sincere sentence from someone showing basic empathy felt powerful enough to crack through every emotional wall I had been desperately holding together since arriving at the restaurant. After spending several minutes in the restroom trying to regain control of my emotions, I finally decided I needed to go back to the table before my absence became even more noticeable. I took one last deep breath, checked my reflection again, and forced my expression into something neutral enough to survive the rest of the evening. My younger cousin gave my arm a small reassuring squeeze before leaving the restroom first, almost like she was trying to give me a few extra seconds to prepare myself mentally. I remember standing there alone for a moment after she walked out, staring at the closed door and silently begging myself not to break down in front of everyone. All I wanted at that point was to get through dinner peacefully, congratulate my cousin properly, and leave without creating a scene. I wasn't looking for confrontation. I wasn't planning some dramatic emotional speech. Honestly, I was still trying to protect my mom from embarrassment despite everything she'd done that night. But the second I returned to the private dining room, I could immediately feel the atmosphere shift. Conversations softened for a brief second when people noticed me walking back toward the table. A few relatives glanced at me carefully before quickly looking away again, clearly aware something uncomfortable had happened even if nobody wanted to openly address it. My seat still sat near the far end of the table exactly where I'd left it, surrounded by half-empty wine glasses, folded napkins, and plates slowly being cleared away by waiters. I tried to slide quietly back into my chair without drawing attention to myself. For one tiny moment, I thought maybe I could still salvage the evening by simply staying silent. Then my mom looked directly at me and rolled her eyes. The expression alone already made my chest tighten again, but what came next completely shattered whatever emotional restraint I still had left. In a sharp, irritated tone loud enough for multiple people nearby to hear, she said, Are you done being dramatic now? The room instantly fell silent around us. Not fully silent, there were still distant restaurant noises somewhere outside the private room, but our table became painfully still. Even the waiter standing nearby awkwardly paused mid-step before quietly moving away. I stared at my mom in complete disbelief. Dramatic. That was the word she chose after humiliating me repeatedly all evening. Not "are you okay?" Not "did I upset you?" Not even concern disguised as politeness. Just immediate irritation that my emotional reaction inconvenienced her. And suddenly, something inside me snapped in a way I honestly didn't expect. It wasn't explosive anger exactly. It was more like years of swallowed emotions finally hitting a breaking point all at once. Every criticism from childhood. Every family gathering where I stayed quiet to keep peace. Every moment I convinced myself I was too sensitive, too emotional, too difficult. It all crashed together inside me within seconds. I slowly put my napkin down beside my plate and looked directly at her. My hands were shaking slightly under the table, but my voice came out calmer than I expected. "I came here to celebrate my cousin," I said carefully, trying to keep my composure. Not to spend the entire night being criticized for existing. The second the words left my mouth, the silence around the table became suffocating. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Several relatives suddenly became intensely focused on their drinks while others stared wide-eyed between me and my mom like they couldn't believe I had finally answered back publicly. My mom's expression changed instantly from irritation to shock. Genuine shock. Like she truly never imagined I would say anything in front of other people. For years, I had always played the role she expected from me, quiet, accommodating, emotionally controlled. Even when her comments hurt me deeply, I usually stayed silent because confronting her only led to accusations that I was overreacting or disrespectful. But that night, something about being publicly humiliated during what should have been a joyful family celebration pushed me past the point of staying quiet for everyone else's comfort. "Oh, please," my mom scoffed after a few seconds, her face tightening defensively. "You're twisting everything I said." But this time, instead of immediately shrinking back like I normally would, I held eye contact with her. And honestly, I think that unsettled her more than my words did. 'Cause for once, I wasn't apologizing for having feelings. I wasn't trying to smooth things over or laugh off the pain to make everyone else comfortable. I was simply telling the truth out loud. "You've criticized me since the moment I walked in," I replied quietly. "My clothes, my hair, my life. Then you embarrassed me in front of everyone like I'm some selfish daughter who abandoned the family." My voice cracked slightly near the end despite how hard I tried to stay composed. "I'm tired of pretending your comments don't hurt me." Nobody at the table spoke. The entire room felt frozen in this uncomfortable mixture of tension, shock, and years of unspoken family dynamics suddenly dragged into the open. I could see emotion flickering across a few relatives' faces, sympathy from some, discomfort from others, maybe even guilt from people who had witnessed similar behavior before but never acknowledged it. My cousin looked devastated sitting beside her fiancé, clearly torn between concern for me and horror that this confrontation was happening during her engagement dinner. My mom opened her mouth again like she was preparing another defensive response, but at that point I couldn't emotionally survive another second there. I felt too exposed, too overwhelmed, too emotionally raw to continue the conversation publicly. So before she could say anything else, I grabbed my purse from the back of my chair and stood up slowly. My legs felt shaky underneath me, but strangely, I also felt lighter than I had all evening. Like finally saying the truth out loud released something I'd been carrying for years. I turned toward my cousin first because she was the only reason I came in the first place. My voice softened immediately when I looked at her. "I'm really sorry tonight turned into this," I told her sincerely. You deserve a beautiful engagement dinner." Her eyes looked watery as she nodded quietly, and I could tell she wanted to say something comforting but didn't know how. I leaned down, hugged her tightly for a second, and congratulated her again before stepping away from the table. Then, without looking back at my mom, I walked out of the restaurant while the silence behind me still hung heavily over the entire room. The moment I stepped outside the restaurant, the cold night air hit my face so sharply that it almost felt unreal. After hours of holding everything in, breathing suddenly felt different out there, not easier exactly, but less suffocating than inside that private dining room. The city streets were quieter than I expected, glowing under soft yellow streetlights while distant traffic moved steadily somewhere beyond the parking lot. I stood near the entrance for a few seconds, gripping my purse tightly against my side, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were still trembling from adrenaline, and my chest felt painfully tight, but underneath all the exhaustion and embarrassment, there was also something unfamiliar slowly rising inside me: relief. Not complete relief, because the entire situation still hurt deeply, but relief that I had finally stopped pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. I walked toward my car mechanically, barely noticing the sound of my heels against the pavement. The entire evening replayed repeatedly in my head like scenes from a movie I couldn't pause. My mom's expression when I first walked in, comments about my appearance, the way relatives avoided eye contact during dinner, the moment she called me dramatic in front of everyone, and then the silence after I finally answered back. Part of me immediately started second-guessing myself the second I got into the driver's seat. Maybe I should have stayed quiet a little longer. Maybe I should have confronted her privately later. Maybe leaving made everything worse for my cousin's special night. Years of conditioning had trained me to instinctively blame myself whenever conflict happened with my mom, even when I knew deep down her behavior had crossed a line. I sat in the parked car without turning the engine on, staring blankly through the windshield while notifications began flooding my phone one after another. The first few messages came from relatives asking where I went. Then more started arriving rapidly after people realized I had actually left. My screen lit up continuously with texts, missed calls, and family group chat notifications. Some messages sounded concerned. Others felt quietly judgmental. One aunt wrote, "You and your mom are both stubborn. Don't let this ruin the family." Another relative texted, "She's still your mother at the end of the day." A cousin I barely even spoke to suddenly sent me a long paragraph about respecting parents no matter what. Reading those messages made my stomach sink all over again because somehow the focus already seemed to be shifting away from what had actually happened and toward the fact that I reacted publicly to it. That was always how these situations worked in my family. Person causing emotional harm rarely became the main issue. Instead, the person who finally reacted to the harm became dramatic, disrespectful, or too emotional. It was like everyone preferred maintaining surface-level peace over acknowledging uncomfortable truths. As long as nobody openly challenged toxic behavior, the family could continue pretending everything was normal. But the moment someone disrupted that illusion, they became the problem that needed fixing. A few minutes later, another text appeared on my screen, this time from my cousin. Unlike the others, her message was short and sincere. "I'm sorry tonight became so painful for you," she wrote. "I noticed more than you think." Reading that nearly made me cry again because after spending the entire evening feeling humiliated and isolated, those few words reminded me I wasn't completely invisible. She followed it with another message apologizing for not stepping in sooner. But honestly, I didn't blame her at all. It was her engagement dinner. She deserved happiness, not family conflict exploding in the middle of one of the most important nights of her life. Then my phone rang again. My mom. Just seeing her name appear on the screen immediately made my entire body tense up. I stared at it vibrating in my hand until the call eventually stopped. Seconds later, another call came. then another. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared, followed by several long text messages arriving one after another. I made the mistake of opening them. According to my mom, I had humiliated her in front of the family and ruined the entire evening over a few harmless comments. She accused me of being overly sensitive, unstable, and selfish for making my cousin's engagement dinner all about me. Reading those words felt almost surreal after everything that had happened. Not once did she acknowledge hurting me. Not once did she apologize for embarrassing me publicly throughout the night. In her version of events, she was the victim because I finally responded instead of silently absorbing the criticism like usual. And honestly, that realization hurt in a completely different way than the comments themselves. Deep down, part of me think I'd still hoped she might eventually understand why I reached my breaking point. Maybe after seeing how upset I became, she'd reflect on her behavior for even a second. But instead, she immediately reframed the entire situation into proof that I was difficult and disrespectful. It suddenly became painfully clear that our relationship had been built around one unspoken expectation for years. I was allowed to have feelings, but only if they stayed quiet enough not to inconvenience her. I leaned my head back against the car seat and closed my eyes, completely emotionally drained. The exhaustion wasn't just from that dinner anymore. Came from years of constantly shrinking myself to preserve peace. Years of trying to earn kindness through patience, silence, and understanding. Years of convincing myself that if I could just become calm enough, successful enough, helpful enough, or forgiving enough, maybe my mom would finally stop treating me like I was never quite enough. But sitting alone in that parking lot, surrounded by the glow of passing headlights and non-stop phone notifications, I finally realized something painful but freeing at the same time. No amount of sacrificing myself was ever going to transform criticism into love. I had spent most of my life trying to avoid disappointing my mom, and somehow I still ended up carrying the blame for her behavior anyway. For the first time in years, I stopped wondering whether I had overreacted. Instead, I started asking myself a completely different question. Why had I spent so long believing I deserved to be treated that way in the first place?